The Sack and Destruction of the City of Columbia, South Carolina, by William Gilmore Simms. Part 3. Chapter 22. The Masons and the Oddfellows. Fraternization. The Cromwell Sword. Among the moral and charitable institutions which suffered greatly in the fire were the several Masonic bodies. They lost everything, with rare exceptions: houses, lodges, regalias, charts, charters, jewels, and every form of implement and paraphernalia. Much of this property had been accumulated in Columbia from Charleston and other places, had been sent hither for safekeeping. Their losses will for a long while be wholly irreparable, and cannot be repaired, unless indeed through the liberality of remote and wealthy fraternities in other sections. The furniture and jewels were, in the largest number of cases, of the richest and most valuable order, wholly of silver, and in great proportion were gifts and bequests of favorite brothers who had reached the highest ranks of the order. We enumerate the following lodges as the chief sufferers: Richland Lodge No. 39, AFM. Acacia Lodge No. 94, AFM. True Brotherhood Lodge No. 84, AFM. These all met in Columbia. Union Kilwinning No. 4, AFM. Orange No. 14, AFM. These met in Charleston. Carolina Chapter No. 1, RAM. Columbia Chapter No. 5, RAM. Union Council No. 5, RAM. Enoch Lodge of Perfection, Ineffable Degrees. Demole Council, Knights of Kadash, Ineffable Degrees. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows and other orders were sufferers in like degree with the Masonic bodies. These were the Palmetto Lodge No. 5, the Congaree Lodge No. 29, the Utah Encampment Lodge No. 2, the Sons of Temperance, and the Sons of Malta. The buildings, chambers, and lodges which contained the treasures of these bodies were first plundered and then given to the flames. The soldiers were to be seen about the streets, dressed up in the aprons, scarves, and regalias. Some of the Federal Masons were active in endeavoring to arrest the robbers of their work, but without success. In a conversation with one of the Western Masons, he responded to the signs and behaved courteously, but he said, "We are told that all fraternization with your Masonic bodies of the South has been cut off, in consequence of your Masons renouncing all connection or tie between them and the Masons of the North." We replied to him that the story was absurd, and evidently set afloat in order to prevent the Northern Masons from affording succor to a Southern brother in the hour of his distress, that Masonry overrides the boundaries of states, allows of no political or religious differences, and that its very nature and constitution are adverse to the idea of any such renunciations of the paramount duties of the craft, in all countries and under all circumstances. We add a few particulars in relation to some of these lodges, showing the extent and character of their losses. The minutes of Union Kilwinning Lodge No. 4 were more than a century old, those of Orange Lodge No. 14 very near a century. These are all gone, and the loss is irremediable. The portion of the minutes of Richland Lodge No. 39 are supposed to be safe, as they were confided to the keeping of a Masonic writer, with a view to the preparation of a history. Among the items of loss, which are particularly lamented, that of the famous sword of the state, called the Cromwell Sword, belonging to the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, is particularly deplored. This was an antique of peculiar interest and value. Its story, as given by Dalcio, may be given here as particularly calculated to gratify the curious, as well as the Masonic reader. It was a large, elegant, and curious two-edged weapon, in a rich velvet scabbard, highly ornamented with Masonic emblems, and with the arms of the Grand Master. It had been presented to the Grand Lodge by the Provincial Grand Master after the installation of the Grand Officers, and was given as a consecrated sword, and received with reverent assurances to keep it safely, so far as human effort could afford safety. The weapon had been long in the possession of the Grand Master's family, and was said to have once belonged to Oliver Cromwell, a legend to which some degree of probability may be given from the fact that the Provincial Grand Master was a descendant of Sir Edward Lee, who was a member of the Long Parliament, and a parliamentary general in the time of the Protector, from whom, perhaps, he received it. The farther history of this sword may as well be given here. From the time of the presentation it continued in the possession of the Grand Lodge, and was borne by the Grand Sword-bearer, or in later times, the Grand Pursuivant, in all public processions. At length, at the conflagration, which in the year 1838 destroyed so large a portion of the city of Charleston, and with other buildings, the Masonic Hall, the sword was, with great difficulty, saved by Brother Samuel Sile, the Grand Tyler, with the loss of the hilt, the scabbard, and a small part of the extremity of the blade. In the confusion consequent on the fire, the sword thus mutilated was mislaid, and for a long time it was supposed to be lost. In 1852, a committee was appointed by the Grand Lodge to make every exertion for its recovery, and at length, in the beginning of the year 1854, it was accidentally found by the Grand Tyler in an outhouse on his premises, and was by him restored to the Grand Lodge in its mutilated condition. The lost piece of the blade was ingeniously replaced by a cutler of the city of Charleston, and being sent to New York was returned with a new hilt and velvet scabbard, and was used in its appropriate place during the centennial ceremonies of that year. With such a history, and blended with such tradition of its origin, we need not feel surprised at the universal and keen feeling occasioned by its loss. Chapter 23. Another day of horrors. When will it end? The bugles. Blackened walls. Sympathizing soldiers. The morning of Saturday, the 18th of February, opened still with its horrors and terrors, though somewhat diminished in their intensity. A lady said to an officer at her house somewhere about 4 o'clock that morning, "In the name of God, sir, when is this work of hell to be ended?" He replied, "You will hear the bugles at sunrise, when a guard will enter the town and withdraw these troops. It will then cease, and not before." Sure enough, with the bugles sound and the entrance of fresh bodies of troops, there was an instantaneous arrest of incendiarism. You could see the rioters carried off in groups and squads from the several precincts they had ravaged, and those which they still meditated to destroy. The tap of the drum, the sound of the signal cannon, could not have been more decisive in its effect, more prompt and complete. But 2 fires were set among private dwellings after sunrise, and the flames only went up from a few places where the fire had been last applied, and these were rapidly expiring. The best and most beautiful portion of Columbia lay in ruins. Never was ruin more complete, and the sun rose with a wan countenance, peering dimly through the dense vapors which seemed wholly to overspread the firmament. Very miserable was the spectacle. On every side ruins and smoking masses of blackened walls, and towers of grim, ghastly chimneys, and between, in desolate groups, reclining on mattresses, or bed, or earth, were wretched women and children, gazing vacantly on the site of a once blessed abode of home and innocence. Roving detachments of the soldiers passed around, and among them. There were those who looked and lingered nigh with taunt and sarcasm. Others there were in whom humanity did not seem wholly extinguished, and others, again, to their credit be it said, who were truly sorrowful and sympathizing, who had labored for the safety of family and property, and who openly deplored the dreadful crime which threatened the lives and honors of the one and destroyed so completely the other. Chapter 24. The destruction of public buildings, explosion of shells, loss of life, the state capitol, heavy loss to the state. But we have no time for description. The relentless fate was hurrying forward, and the destroyer had still as large a share of his assigned labors to execute. This day was devoted to the destruction of those buildings of a public character which had escaped the wreck of the city proper. The Saluda cotton manufactory, the property of Colonel L.D. Childs, was burned by the troops prior to their entry of the city and on their approach to it the previous day. The several powder mills were destroyed on Saturday. The arsenal buildings, state and Confederate, on Sunday, and it is understood that in the attempt to haul away ammunition from the latter place, the Federals lost a large number of men from an unlooked-for explosion. It is reported in one case that no less than 40 men, with their officers, the entire company, were blown to pieces in one precinct and half as many in another. But the facts can never be precisely ascertained. The body of a Federal captain lay on the banks of the river for several days. The magnificent steam printing establishment of Evans and Cogswell, with the house assigned to their engravers, and another house stored with stationery and book stock, perhaps the most complete establishment of the kind in the southern states, was destroyed on Saturday. These were all private property, most of it isolated in situation and deliberately fired. So the fearful progress of incendiarism continued throughout Saturday and Sunday, nor did it wholly cease on Monday. The gas-works, one of the great necessities of the people, was then deliberately destroyed, and it was with some difficulty that the waterworks were saved. The cotton card manufactory of the state, the sword factory, a private interest, the stocking manufactory, private, the buildings at fairgrounds, adjoining cemetery, the several railway depots, Alexander's foundry, the South Carolina Railroad foundry and workshops, the government armory, and other buildings of greater or less value, partly government and partly private property, all shared a common fate. Major Nearnsey, the state architect, was a great loser in his implements and valuable scientific and professional library. The new Capitol building, being unfinished and not likely to be finished in many years, useless, according to us, was spared, only suffering from some petty assaults of malice. Here and there a plinth fractured, here and there a Corinthian capital. The beautiful pillar of Tennessee marble was thus injured. So, at great painstaking, the soldiers clambered up on ladders to reach and efface the exquisite scroll and ornamental work on the face of the building, disfiguring the beautiful chiseling which had wrought out the vine and acorn tracery on the several panels, and the bundles of fasces on the northern part were fractured or broken away in parts. The statue of Washington, in bronze, cast in 1858 for the city of Charleston from Houdon's original in the rotunda at Richmond, received several bruises from brickbats addressed to face and breast. A shell scratched his back, and the staff, which he bore in his hand, was broken off in the middle. But the bronze seems to have defied destruction, and may be considered still perfect. The bust of Calhoun, by Powers, was totally destroyed. So also was the ideal personification by the sculptor Brown of the genius of liberty. Footnote. This is an error. The W.J. Hubert factory of Richmond had cast 6 bronze copies of Houdon's marble statue of Washington, which stands in the Capitol in Richmond, and offered them for sale at $10,000 apiece. One was bought for South Carolina by Governor R.F.W. Alston in 1858 and paid for by legislative appropriations. End of footnote. A large collection of complete capitals, destined for the capital and lying in the open square, were destroyed either by the heat of the contiguous fire or by explosions of gunpowder introduced among them. Hereafter, such beautiful pieces of workmanship might be kept more safely and certainly by being buried deeply in excavations of sand. The iron palmetto tree, that ingenious performance of Werner of Charleston, dedicated as a monument to the Palmetto Regiment, so renowned in the war with Mexico, suffered the loss of a number of its lower and larger branches, but these we think may be restored at comparatively little cost. The apartment in the base was torn open, having been wrenched from its fastenings, but no other mischief seems to have been done to it. It was probably spared as commemorating the deeds of those who had fought under their own flag. An officer connected with the state capitol furnishes the following particulars. The new state capitol presented a very conspicuous mark to the cannon on Lexington Heights, yet fortunately sustained but little injury. None, indeed, which cannot be easily repaired. 5 shots struck the west end, yet none of them did any serious damage, except one. This shattered the ornamented sill and balusters of one of the corridors of the principal floor. Another shell injured a fluted column on the center projection. 2 shots hit the interior of the brick arch over the eastern front center window, and 2 other shots struck and slightly scaled off the granite jamb division of the treble center window on the eastern front. When in possession, the soldiers tried to deface and defile as much as they could. They wrote their names in pencil on the marble, giving their companies and regiments, and sometimes coupling appropriately foul comments with their signatures, thus addressed to posterity. They seem to have found considerable sport in their practice, with brickbats or fragments of rocks as sharpshooters, and making the fine bronze statue of Washington their mark. They won various successes against his face, breast, and legs. Sundry bruises and abrasions are to be found upon the head and front, and part of his cane has been carried away among their spolia opima. Footnote. On the Missouri red granite base, supplied about 1909, upon which the statue stands, the writer, with an appropriation by the General Assembly, has placed a bronze tablet testifying to the facts here stated. The cane has not been repaired. As broken, it preserves history, and at the same time is an object lesson of what the passions of war will do: destroy respect for the national heroes of those who are doing the destroying. End of footnote. The finely sculptured oak leaf decorations of the marble door pilasters at the main entrance door of the principal floor over the northern front, as well as the ornaments of the soffit of that door, have been seriously defaced. The beaks of the eagles in the panels above and to the right and left of that doorway, as also the lower portions of the fasces on each side of the same, had been beaten out. The corner, or groin stones, the basement cornice at the southwestern corner of the building, were also damaged to some extent by the fire from the adjacent Old State House building. But all the injuries to the structure were insignificant in comparison with that which was done to the finished and raw material within the precinct, the wrought and rude marble, granite, iron, and machinery, the work completed in these materials and which has been accumulating for the last 4 years in yard and workshop. In all this, our loss has been very great. There were destroyed among those accumulations 40 beautifully sculptured Corinthian capitals, designed for the 2 large porticos of the edifice, and wrought in our own beautiful native granite. The Corinthian capitals wrought in Italian marble for the great marble hall and staircase on the principal floor in the interior, all the polished shafts in Tennessee marble for the latter, and nearly all the marble work and pavements for the whole building in Tennessee and Italian marble, together with the granite balustrade and railings surmounting the main building and for the surrounding terrace. To these add the destruction of hundreds of immense unwrought blocks of granite and marble of every description, machinery, tools, the sculptor's atelier and workshops, containing all the models and some of the unfinished statues meant for the main gable field or tympanum of the northern front, the original models of the medallion portraits of Hayne and McDuffie, and one of the latest and best casts of the head of Calhoun. But one small storehouse remains uninjured throughout the premises, containing some finished marble work, the monolith granite columns of the main porticos, and some completed work for the main cornice of the structure. The total pecuniary loss to the state, in the damage thus done to the new Capitol, and to the material designed for it, including tools, instruments, models, etc., can fall very little short of $1 million in specie. Chapter 25. Treatment of the Negroes. General Sherman and the dead Negro. Who caused the war? Something should be said in respect to the manner in which the Negroes were treated by the Federals while in Columbia, and as regards the influences employed by which to beguile or take them from their owners. We have already adverted to the fact that there was a vast difference between the feelings and performances of the men from the West and those coming or directly emanating from the Eastern states. The former were adverse to a connection with them, but few Negroes were to be seen among these, and they were simply used as drudges, grooming horses, bearing burdens, humble of demeanor, and rewarded with kicks, cuffs, and curses, frequently without provocation. They despised and disliked the Negro, openly professed their scorn or hatred, declared their unwillingness to have them as companions in arms, or in company at all. Several instances have been given us of their modes of repelling the association of the Negro, usually with blow of the fist, butt of the musket, slash of the sword, or prick of the bayonet. Sherman himself looked on these things indifferently, if we are to reason from a single fact afforded us by Mayor Goodwin. This gentleman, while walking with the general, heard the report of a gun. Both heard it, and immediately proceeded to the spot. There they found a group of soldiers, with a stalwart young Negro fellow lying dead between them in the street, the body yet warm and bleeding. Pushing it with his feet, Sherman said in his quick, hasty manner, "What does this mean, boys?" The reply was sufficiently cool and careless. "The damned black rascal gave us his impudence, and we shot him." "Well, bury him at once. Get him out of sight." As they passed on, one of the party remarked, "Is that the way, General, you treat such a case?" "Oh," said he, "we have no time now for courts-martial and things of that sort." A lady showed us a coverlet, with huge holes burned in it, which she said had covered a sleeping Negro woman, when the Yankees threw their torches into her bed, from which she was narrowly extricated with life. Of the recklessness of these soldiers, especially when sharpened by cupidity, an instance is given where they thrust their bayonets into a bed, where they fancied money to be hidden, between two sleeping children, being, it is admitted, somewhat careful not to strike through the bodies of the children. The treatment of the Negroes in their houses was, in the larger proportion of cases, quite as harsh as that which was shown to the whites. They were robbed in like manner, frequently stripped of every article of clothing and provisions, and where the wigwam was not destroyed, it was effectually gutted. Few Negroes having a good hat, good pair of shoes, good overcoat, but were incontinently deprived of them, and roughly handled when they remonstrated. These acts, we believe, were mostly ascribed to Western men. They were repeatedly heard to say, "We are Western men, and don't want your damned black faces among us." When addressing the Negro, they frequently charged him with being the cause of the war. In speaking to the whites on this subject, especially to South Carolinians, the cause was ascribed to them. In more than one instance, we are told, "We are going to burn this damned town. We've begun, and we'll go through. This thing began here, and we'll stack the houses and burn the town." A different role was assigned to, or self-assumed by, the Eastern men. They hobnobbed with the Negro, walked with him, and smoked and joked with him, filled his ears with all sorts of blarney, lured him not only with hopes of freedom, but all manner of license. They hovered about the premises of the citizens, seeking all occasion to converse with the Negroes. They would elude the guards, slip into the kitchens, if the gates are open, or climb over the rear fence and converse with all who would listen. No doubt they succeeded in beguiling many, since nothing is more easy than to seduce, with promises of prosperity, ease, and influence, the laboring classes of any people, white or black. To teach them that they are badly governed and suffering wrong is the favorite method of demagogism in all countries, and is that sort of influence which will always prevail with a people at once vain, sensual, and ignorant. But as far as we have been able to see and learn, a large proportion of the Negroes were carried away forcibly. When the beguiler failed to seduce, he resorted to violence. The soldiers, in several cases which have been reported to us, pursued the slaves with the tenacity of bloodhounds, were at their elbow when they went forth, and hunted them up, at all hours, on the premises of the owner. Very frequent are instances where the Negro, thus hotly pursued, besought protection of his master or mistress, sometimes voluntarily seeking a hiding place along the swamps of the river, at other times finding it under the bed of the owner, and not leaving these places of refuge till long after the troops had departed. For fully a month after they had gone, the Negroes, singly or in squads, were daily making their way back to Columbia, having escaped from the Federals by dint of great perseverance and cunning, generally in wretched plight, half-starved, and with little clothing. They represented the difficulties in the way of their escape to be very great, the officers placing them finally under guards at night, and that they could only succeed in flight at the peril of life or limb. Many of these were Negroes of Columbia, but the larger proportion seemed to hail from Barnwell. They all sought passports to return to their owners in plantations. Chapter 26. The adjacent country, horses, mules, etc., carried off or killed, vehicles destroyed, rape, torture. We should not overlook the ravage and destruction in the immediate precincts of the city, though beyond its corporate boundaries. Within a few miles of Columbia, from 2 to 5 miles, it was girdled by beautiful country seats, such as those of the Hampton family, Millwood, a place famous of yore for its charm and elegance of society, its frank hospitality, and the lavish bounty of its successive hosts. The destruction of this family seat of opulence and grace and hospitality will occasion sensation in European countries, no less than in our own, among those who have enjoyed its grateful privileges, as guests in better days. The beautiful country seats of Mr. Secretary Trenholm, of Dr. John Wallace, Mrs. Thomas Stark, Colonel Thomas Taylor, Captain James U. Adams, Mr. C. P. Pelham, Mill Creek, as well as Homestead and many more, all shared the fate of Millwood. All were robbed and ruined, then given to the flames, and from these places were carried off all horses, mules, cattle, hogs, and stock of every sort, and the provisions not carried off were destroyed. In many cases, where mules and horses were not choice, they were shot down. But this was the common history. On all the farms and plantations, and along the roadsides everywhere, for many a mile, horses, mules, and cattle strew the face of the country. Young colts, however fine the stock, had their throats cut. One informant tells us that in one pile he counted 40 slain mules on the banks of the Saluda. Every vehicle that could not be carried away was destroyed. But there were barbarities reported in the more isolated farm settlements and country houses. Horrid narratives of rape are given, which we dare not attempt to individualize. Individuals suspected of having concealed large sums of money were hung up repeatedly until almost in the agonies of death, and to escape the torture they confessed where the deposit had been made. A German baker had a rope put around his neck and was hauled up several times, until, through fear of death, he confessed that he had specie around his person and in a trunk. A family of the name of Fox, of Lexington, were treated with especial cruelty. The head of the family was hung up thrice by the neck till nearly dead. Then he yielded $9,000 in specie. Mr. Meats, of the same district, is reported to have been robbed in like manner and by the same process, and one poor idiot, a crazy creature, mistaken for another party, was subjected, till nearly dead, to the same treatment. This mode of torture, from what we can learn, was frequently resorted to. Other parties were whipped, others buffeted or knocked down, and, indeed, every form of brutality seems to have been put into practice. Whatever cupidity was sharpened into rage by denial or disappointment. But we sicken at the further recital of these cruelties. Chapter 27. Conclusion. The reader will have seen that we have brought into a close our narrative of the most conspicuous events in the capture, sack, and burning of the city of Columbia. We have been at great pains to make the statements ample and to justify them by reference to the best authorities and witnesses to be found. We believe that the facts are substantially complete, and so true in all respects. The incidents given are selected as typical, large groups of facts, representative anecdotes, uniform in their variety, and quite too numerous for separate consideration. But the very uniformity amidst such a numerous collection is in confirmation of the general authenticity of the whole, and we repeat the conviction that the narrative is wholly true withal, and to be relied on as a history. We have seen with surprise some attempts in sundry quarters to account for the destruction of Columbia by ascribing it to accident, to the drunkenness of straggling parties, to our negroes, and indeed to any but the proper cause. It is evidently the design of these writers, without inquiring into the motives by which they were governed, to relieve General Sherman and his army from the imputation. Footnote. The most despicable of all the false charges made was that made in an official report by Sherman, that the fire started from cotton which General Hampton had ordered piled in the streets and burned. Hampton's letter to Sherman, answering the charge, was sufficient to disprove the charge to the satisfaction of any open-minded, honest person. But Sherman's frank admission in his Memoirs, Volume 2, page 287, shows how utterly untruthful he was, and how low he would stoop to further injure those he had wronged. Quote, "In my official report of this conflagration, I distinctly charged it to General Wade Hampton, and confess I did so pointedly to shake the faith of his people in him, for he was, in my opinion, a braggart, and professed to be the special champion of South Carolina." End quote. End footnote. It could be shown that one half of the army were not actually engaged in firing the houses in 20 places at once, while the other half were not quiet spectators, indifferently looking on. There might be some shrewdness in this suggestion. If it could be shown that the whiskey found its way out of stores and cellars, grappled with the soldiers, and poured itself down their throats, then they are relieved of their responsibility. If it can be proved that the Negroes were not terrified by the presence of these soldiers in such large numbers, and did not, as they almost invariably did, on the night of the fire, skulk away into their cabins, lying quite low and keeping as dark as possible, we might listen to this suggestion and perhaps admit its plausibility. But why did the soldiers prevent the firemen from extinguishing the fire, as they strove to do? Why did they cut the hose as soon as it was brought into the streets? Why did they not assist in extinguishing the flames? Why, with 20,000 men encamped in the streets, did they suffer the stragglers to succeed in the work of such extent? Why did they suffer the men to break into the stores and drink the liquor wherever it was found? And what shall we say to the universal plundering which was a part of the object obtained through the means of fire? Why, above all, did they, with their guards, massed at every corner, suffer the Negroes to do this work? These questions answered, it will be seen that all the suggestions are sheer nonsense. To give them plausibility, we have been told, among other misstatements, that General Sherman himself was burned out of his own selected quarters no less than 4 times. This is simply ridiculous. He was burned out in no single instance. Footnote: Sherman's headquarters was the handsome new mansion of Mr. William Talley at 1615 Gervais Street. It is still standing. End of footnote. None of his generals was burned out. The houses chosen for their abodes were carefully selected, and the fire was kept from approaching them in any single instance. But we have pursued our narrative very imperfectly, if our array of facts be not such as conclusively to show that the destruction of the city was a deliberately designed thing, inflexibly fixed from the beginning, and its fate sufficiently well known to be conceived and comprehended by all the army. Long before the army left Savannah, a lady inquired of one of the Federal generals in that city whether she should retire, mentioning her preference of Columbia. His reply was significant: "Go anywhere but to Columbia." We have stated the conference between the Lady Superior of the Ursuline Convent and a certain major of the Federals, who originally belonged to a press gang of Detroit. He warned her at 11 o'clock of Friday that she would need all the guards he had brought, as Columbia was a doomed city. A lady in one of our upper districts, expressing surprise at the treatment of Columbia at this 19th or boasted century of civilization, was answered, "South Carolina has been long since the promised boon of Sherman's army." Masonic brethren told others in the city that an order had been issued to the troops before they crossed the river, giving them license to sack, plunder, and destroy for a space of 36 hours, and that Columbia was destined to destruction. A sick Federal soldier, who had been fed, nursed, and kindly treated by a city lady, told her on Friday morning that the place would be destroyed that night. The simultaneous breaking out of the fires in the heart of the city and in the suburbs, in 20 places besides, should certainly conclude all doubt. 1. Enough that Sherman's army was under perfect discipline. They were, as an army, completely in the hands of the officers. Never was discipline more complete, never authority more absolute. 2. That the fire was permitted, whether set by drunken stragglers or Negroes, to go on, and Sherman's soldiers, prevented by their active opposition efforts of the firemen, while thousands looked on in perfect serenity, seemingly totally indifferent to the event. 3. That soldiers, quite sober, were seen in hundreds of cases, busily engaged in setting fire, well provided with the implements and agencies. 4. That they treated with violence the citizens who strove to arrest the flames. 5. They, when entreated and exhorted by citizens to arrest the incendiaries and prevent the catastrophe, At the very outset, the officers, in many cases, treated the applicants cavalierly and gave no heed to their application. 6. That during the raging of the flames, the act was justified by a reference to the course of South Carolina in originating the secession movement. 7. That the general officers themselves held aloof until near the close of the scene and of the night. That General Sherman knew what was going on, yet kept aloof and made no effort to arrest it until daylight on Saturday, ought of itself to be conclusive. 8. That with his army under such admirable discipline, he could have arrested it at any moment, and that he did arrest it, when it pleased him to do so, even at the raising of a finger, at the tap of a drum, at the blast of a single trumpet. But what need of these and 1,000 other suggestive reasons to establish a charge which might be assumed from a survey of Sherman's general progress, from the moment when he entered South Carolina? The march of his army was a continued flame. The tread of his horse was devastation. On what plea was the picturesque village of Barnwell destroyed? We had no army there for its defense. No issue of strength in its neighborhood had excited the passions of the combatants. Yet it was plundered, every house, and nearly all burned to the ground. And this, too, where the town was occupied by women and children only. So, too, the fate of Blackville, Graham, Bamberg, Buford's Bridge, Lexington, etc., all hamlets of most modest character, where no resistance was offered, where no fighting took place, where there was no provocation of liquor even, and where the only exercise of heroism was at the expense of women, infancy, and feebleness. Such, too, was the fate of every farmhouse, of 6 and 7 at least. Footnote. The writer possesses a decanter given him by his mother that was one of a pair that stood upon a shelf, with bottles and other objects, in the smokehouse of her parents in Orangeburg district. Below that shelf was a trough of lard for family use. Sherman's men removed the cover to the trough, and with their bayonets swept the glass objects off the shelf so they would crash together in the lard and render it unsafe for use. Several pieces of glass were chipped off around the mouth of this particular decanter, which was salvaged. All throughout the day, the soldiers were trying by various Yankee tricks to get the family out of the house so they could fire it, but they remained together, usually in one room, and saved the house. One trick was to go under the house and call out that they were going to blow it up. One soldier found that he had tricked himself. My grandfather killed many hogs each winter, and saved their hair to mulch Irish potatoes with in the spring by burying it. The soldier found the fresh-turned earth and fancied that he had found the place where treasure was buried, and procured a hoe and dug up the hog's hair, to his chagrin. End of footnote. Surely, when such was the fate and treatment in all cases, there need be no effort now to show that an exception was to be made in favor of the state capital, where the offenses charged upon South Carolina had been necessarily of the rankest character, and which they had passed Columbia, greatly bemoaning the cruel fate which, under stragglers and whiskey drinkers and negroes, had brought her to ruin. What were the offenses of the village of Alston, Pomeria, Winnsboro, Blackstock, Society Hill, and the towns of Camden and Cheraw? Thus weeping over the cruelty which so unhappily destroyed Columbia, was it that she should enjoy fellowship in woe and ashes, that they gave all these towns and villages to the flames, and laid waste all the plantations and farms between? But enough. In the conscience of any man be sufficiently flexible on this subject to coerce his understanding even into a momentary doubt, all argument will be wasted on him. Our task has ended. Our narrative is drawn by an eyewitness of much of this terrible drama, and of many of the scenes which it includes. But the chief part has been drawn from the living mouths of a cloud of witnesses, male and female, the best people in Columbia. The following is a list of the owners and occupants of the houses destroyed. A list of the property destroyed. Ellipses. This list shows that 265 dwellings or buildings used as stores and dwellings, about 50% being used for both purposes, 107 stores, 58 buildings used as banks, offices, barbershops, and livery and sales stables, 15 warehouses and railroad depots, 19 factories, mills, and machine shops, 7 church buildings, 4 school buildings, 4 printing and engraving plants, 5 public buildings, and 2 hotels, making a total of 486 buildings, were destroyed with nearly all of their contents.